Red Dawn versus Red Dawn, when it doesn't matter what decade it is and you just gotta kill commies. Warning, I'm going to spoil a lot of both films. So if you haven't seen either one, I suggest you stop and watch the original Red Dawn before you watch the remake. But I'll give you a moment now to go do that, and come back. You do it? Okay, good. Let's continue. When I was younger, I didn't have cable. As a result, my family pretty much lived at the local video store. After we watched all the new releases, we would often raid the rest of the store, which meant the old classic sections. One of my favorite films to watch was Red Dawn. It had Patrick Swayze, action, political conflict based on a potential real event. And did I say Patrick Swayze? So as a result, the original Red Dawn has a special place in my heart. Not because it's just a really well put together action film, but because it also has some childhood nostalgia for me. So, years later, when I heard they were making a remake, I thought, hey, it could be fun, why not? Then information about the film started to leak out, and I heard the enemy was going to be China instead of Russia, so I figured, that was okay because the Cold War's over. We won. Yay. So as far as potential political conflicts go, a war with China isn't necessarily that unbelievable. However, MGM decided to change their minds about who the enemy in the film was going to be. Basically, word got out that China was going to be the bad guy in the Red Dawn film, and a variety of Chinese blogs got rather upset about this. And MGM, not wanting to alienate the audiences in China, decided to change the enemy in the film to North Korea. So as a result, they spent an additional $2.2 million having CG animators put in Korean flags on all the uniforms, and even poorly animating in Korean flags in the backgrounds of some offices. So the potentially laughable main enemy in the remake is just the beginning of what they did wrong in the film. And now I'm going to break it down for you in a number of different categories to why I think the remake failed miserably in comparison to the original. The intro. The intro in the original did everything it needed to do within 30 seconds. It started by showing you a few title cards that set the stage for global events. That's all that really needed to happen to get you into the film. The lack of narrative allowed the viewers to imagine the events and kind of think of what would be required for it to happen. And that was the beauty of it. You didn't need any more than that to kind of get into the film. The remake, on the other hand, shows you the same overdone news montage that's been done almost 100 times, using words like computers and hacking, the type of buzzwords that might scare your grandmother off the computer. So the audience is shown a series of news flashes showing Russia suffering terrorist attacks and North Korea somehow growing more powerful, however unlikely that is. The only film to ever really pull off the news montage was the Dawn of the Dead remake by Zack Snyder. And even the point of that, though, is to leave you confused about world events. The remake just doesn't have the creative narrative to try something different, or something that hasn't already been done 100 times. The choice in enemies. What makes the first Red Dawn so good and relatable is that it has a premise that, at the time, was something that actually played on the fears people had. War with the Soviet Union was a real possibility, and it was a fear that influenced much of the popular culture of the 1980s. Yes, the idea of a war with the Soviets being anything other than a giant exchange of atomic weapons is a bit of a stretch, but to some point the Soviets had a capacity where they could land troops on American soil. And the original Red Dawn made it a point to talk about how South American forces were coming up through Texas because the Soviets had influenced them to do so, which made it actually seem believable. The remake picks an enemy that has never been a threat to the United States. The primary enemy being the North Koreans is a dismally poor choice. The idea that the hermit state that lacks a collective will to feed itself can muster the strength required to invade the United States is a gigantic stretch of the imagination. The remake somehow justifies the North Koreans as being a plausible threat by saying they use a combination of EMP and the Russians supplying the North Koreans with a considerable amount of hardware. However, there just wouldn't be enough hardware on the planet to move that much men to make an actual dent on the American coastline for a beachhead. At least with China, there could have been a series of events that took place to cause American relations with them to sour, and the resulting economic strife causing the two countries to compete directly against each other. That right there is enough justification to kind of make this story believable. But instead, because MGM didn't want to lose that audience, they decided to change it to the North Koreans, which seems like a really, really silly choice. And the number one thing in this that bugs me the most about them picking the North Koreans is that the entirety of the North Korean army would have to fight its way through South Korea before they could even really do anything to attack the United States. And even in their news clip-ridden intro, where they could have just said something about Korean unification, they didn't. That tiny tidbit of information could have just turned their story from completely implausible to 10% believable if they had just done that, but they chose not to. Character choices. In the original, the main characters had no military experience. They were just young people forced into a terrible situation, just like the vast majority of other people sucked into conflicts. The remake, however, chose to make one of the main characters a Marine. That choice right there makes the story less relatable. The idea of being a scared young adult trapped in a war zone is a lot more interesting than a person who served in an active duty capacity. I say this because an individual who served in combat like that has an understanding of what's going to happen and the situation. An individual who has no experience with that has a lot more opportunities to expand as a character and to react to these situations genuinely without any type of prior knowledge or experience. In the original, when the Soviets or Cuban troops first land, there is utter panic and people are completely confused, and it's complete chaos for the people involved. In the remake, Chris Hemsworth's character is just so well put together, he understands what's going on the entire time, and there's almost no panic in his character at all. So it just kind of presents the story in two different ways, where one is exponentially more interesting, and the remake is just kind of like this dull action film that doesn't really go into any character depth or human emotion about the terror of the situation. The original Red Dawn has several moments where it uses imagery very well. I say this because it displays all the characters, at least on the side fighting for the American forces in Patrick Swayze's camp, as looking very similar to that of the Mujahideen, who were the primary enemy of the Soviets in Afghanistan. The remake has several opportunities to exploit the irony of an active-duty American soldier fighting a war against an occupying enemy. So essentially, the active-duty soldier becoming a terrorist and fighting the people who are trying to nation-build in his own backyard. But every moment the remake has to kind of narrate this and tell a story, it just loses all progress on it and just washes it away in a single sentence that has no emotion or potential to it. So it's just a wasted opportunity. The best examples of emotion used in the original. Essentially, the mayor's son, since the beginning of the film, ends up in the camp of the Wolverines. However, one night when he decides to go back into town, he gets captured and they force him to swallow a transmitter. There's a considerable amount of emotion there because it's clear he doesn't necessarily want to betray his comrades, but he's being forced to because his father basically turned him in. Now the Wolverines are forced with a horrible situation of knowing one of their own betrayed them, but it wasn't just a singular, very shallow character reason. It was because of a very deep, complex situation between his father and the Russian occupying forces. So it's a very complex emotional situation. And the same thing is kind of done in the remake. However, it's done entirely different, where the son of the mayor is tagged kind of like a gazelle with a radio transmitter, and he accidentally leads them back to their camp. So there's really no emotion there, and the entire situation there is wasted for basically just a bravado hero moment that almost doesn't make any sense. Making the bad guys bad. In the remake of Red Dawn, they start out the film by the paratroopers coming in and kind of shooting at people and things like that, and then fleeing to the foothills. But then shortly after that, you have one of the main North Korean commanders coming up the hill after having captured the kid's father, a sergeant of the local police department. And what's kind of odd about that is because it's putting a disproportionate amount of importance on these individuals who are just partisans in the hills. And as to why a commander like that would waste his time going after 5 people in the mountains makes no sense. And it's just kind of those things where, like, well, I guess he doesn't have enough to do. You know, I guess he's not busy enough invading America, so he's just going to go after several preteens in the hills. The original had them flee to the mountains, where the Soviets had no idea they were there. However, they had a list of people who were missing and unaccounted for, so they assumed they were partisans or probably just dead. So it makes sense as to why in the original they didn't really know they were out there and allowed them to form in kind of bands of guerrillas. And essentially in the original they became guerrillas, not intentionally, but because Soviets stumbled upon them and they had to defend themselves. In the remake they just decided, because their father was executed, that they were going to fight a war of insurgency against the North Koreans. The original did really well was it portrayed the emotional impact and weight of everything they did. from the first encounter they have with the Soviets, where they basically brutally murdered a group of 3 Soviet soldiers out sightseeing. So essentially that action of murdering 3 Soviet soldiers had weight. Because essentially what's going to happen is the Soviets, out of reprisal, were going to execute members of their own community. Because historically, countries like Nazi Germany or the Soviet Union had this concept of lists. So when partisans would come out and kill their own, like kill soldiers of the Nazis or the Soviets, they had a list of individuals who would be executed as a reprisal to essentially offset or make it really, really untenable for partisans to kill their soldiers, because they didn't want to have their own communities be decimated by their own actions. So as a result, in the original, by them taking up arms and killing the 3 Soviet soldiers, they effectively killed their own parents because of what they did. So the situation and the emotion behind it had weight. Where in the remake, there's only one instance where a civilian population is about to be executed, but they're heroically rescued by the Wolverines. To where you have almost the worst and most childish put out of the phrase Wolverine that I've ever experienced in cinema. The passage of time. The original Red Dawn has a wonderfully displayed passage of time, and it shows the audience in very wide shots of nature that months have passed since the beginning of the war, and they want you to know what's going on and how long it's been. In the remake, it's shot in such a way and rushed so quickly that it almost feels like the film takes place over a matter of days. The remake is just perpetually rushing. Where the original took its time and used the situation to build the emotional tension of the events in the film, the remake just rushes everything. Everything has to be done within an amount of time. They have to have an action sequence or explosion within 40 to 50 seconds of each other. And they just don't ever take the time to build the film up. And that's just where it fails. And now, to the number one thing that annoyed me the most about the remake, and made completely no sense. So essentially, the Wolverines are running through the city trying to escape the North Koreans. So they see a tank, so they dodge into a Subway shop. And this Subway shop still has everything. Meat, bread, everything you'd need to make a Subway sandwich. And this is, I don't know how long after the occupation has started, so we don't necessarily know the duration of time. But somehow, even though the Subway is under direct enemy occupation, they have the ability to eat fresh. A clear separation between the original and the remake emerges when you look at the original had an ending. It was completely planned out. The storyline would end. Where the remake goes down a path where it almost tries to have a sequel. The ending in the original has this beautiful moment where both the brothers are bleeding out and dying. So they're essentially fighting this last battle in their own hometown, and they go to the swing set in the center of their town. This is where they basically would meet their father for a time. So this is where they decide to end their lives. Where in the remake, you have this really poorly constructed speech given by the younger brother that is a word-for-word verbatim speech that his older brother gave him. And then it just kind of ends with them driving a Mustang Ford car with a minigun on it at a North Korean prison camp. So in a way, it's a very anticlimactic ending to the story, and is a blatant attempt for them to have a sequel of some sort. So in the end, the remake is a really bad film that just goes along the lines of, hey, wouldn't it be cool if they had a car with a minigun on it? Where the original is actually a film based in reality that takes chances and actually develops the story within a real context. But thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, and you have yourself a great evening or day.